Hello and welcome to the DSR Daily. I'm David Rothkopf, one of your hosts, joined today by Riley Fessler. How are you doing, Riley?
Pretty good.
It's the end of the week, which is, something. And it's a 3-day weekend, isn't it?
That's right.
For most Americans, we won't be doing this podcast on Monday, will we? We're honoring Indigenous people, aren't we not?
That is correct.
Yes. So let us honor Indigenous people. They certainly deserve, at the very least, a holiday, if not the entire country back. And frankly, at this point, I would be pretty happy to just hand it right back to them. But having said that, we'll do our usual end of the week rundown and talk a little bit about some of the pods we've done this week that you might want to refer to get a little more in depth on those stories. So you kick it off, Rod.
Prosecutor appointed by President Trump secured an indictment of New York's Attorney General Letitia James on charges of bank fraud and making false statements in Virginia. The indictment, sought after Trump publicly demanded she be charged, accuses Ms. James of falsely claiming she would use a Norfolk home as a secondary residence to secure favorable loan terms while using it instead as a rental investment property. Ms. James, a Democrat who had won a civil case against Mr. Trump, called the indictment a continuation of the president's desperate weaponization of our justice system, asserting the charges are baseless. These charges deepen concerns that the president is using the Justice Department to target his political adversaries, overriding the judgment of career prosecutors who previously found insufficient evidence to bring the case.
Yeah, according to everything that we know, she didn't actually do anything wrong. By the way, according to what we know, a number of people in the Trump administration did do something wrong in this regard. In any event, it seems like a relatively minor infraction. But prosecutors looked at it, decided not to pursue it. So he got rid of them. And he's, said, no, I'm going to go after these people who went after me. What's the difference? What's weaponization and what's not weaponization? Well, it's not weaponization to go after somebody who actually commits a crime, like Trump, or where there's a lot of evidence that they committed a crime, like Trump. It's weaponization if you go after people for vindictive reasons where there is no crime, where you're trumping up the charges. And that's what's happened with James Comey, and that's what's happening with Letitia James, and it seems likely to happen with other people. These are the most grievous abuses of our justice system by a president of the United States ever. And you might say, well, we went through all this with the Comey thing. This is just another example. Don't get numb to this. He will do it several times, but it also gives them broader openings to go after lots of people. One of the cases that they would like to make is that anybody who supports an organization that they characterize as Antifa or opposition is guilty of supporting terrorism. And while as their targets right now are people like George Soros, who of course has never done anything of the sort, have you donated money to one of those kind of organizations? Will you be somehow penalized for supporting people who oppose Trump? That's where this is leading, and that's why we need to be aware of it, and why we need to call it out, and why we need to make sure everybody around us understands just what an abuse this is.
The Senate unanimously voted to repeal the 2002 resolution that authorized the U.S. invasion of Iraq, following a similar vote in the House, which effectively signals the closing chapter of the two-decade-old war. The bipartisan amendment, sponsored by Senators Tim Kaine and Todd Young, was added to the annual defense bill to prevent future abuses of power and reassert Congress's authority to start and end military conflicts. Though it remains unclear if President Trump will sign the bill, as his administration previously cited the resolution to justify a 2020 drone strike, the repeal is expected to be in the final defense measure, which also rescinds the 1991 Gulf War authorization.
This may seem like housekeeping to you, but multiple White Houses have used this authorization to enable them to commit all sorts of crimes, or enable, that's an overstatement, to enable them to commit all sorts of acts that were really beyond their purview, that really should have been things that were approved by the Congress. And, that's, why, Trump may or may not sign it. Here's the problem. Trump doesn't care about this stuff. There's no legal justification for blowing up, boats in the high seas in the Caribbean. And, just because you say there's, cartels or drug smugglers on board, doesn't give you the right to do that. So they don't care about things like this anymore. So yeah, I'm very happy that the Congress is getting rid of something that they should have gotten rid of, 23 years ago, or maybe never passed, given that it was an invasion of Iraq that was utterly unjustified as it was. But, we now have a president who doesn't care about this stuff and a Congress that won't stand up to him. So looks a little bit like housekeeping to no end to me.
The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas went into effect on Friday, prompting thousands of displaced Palestinians to stream back toward their abandoned homes in Gaza, despite widespread destruction. The agreement, ratified by the Israeli government, includes a limited withdrawal of Israeli troops from parts of Gaza and a suspension of hostilities. A key provision mandates that Hamas is expected to release the 20 living Israeli hostages within 72 hours, followed by Israel's release of 250 long-term Palestinian prisoners and 1,700 recent detainees. This truce is the first phase of U.S. President Trump's initiative to end the two-year war, with future phases intended to address the demilitarization of Gaza, the disarmament of Hamas, and the ultimate governance of the territory.
Yeah, if the hostages get released, if the bodies of dead hostages are returned home, if the fighting stops, as we said yesterday, let's be grateful for that. But as we discussed on our special emergency pod that we did yesterday on this, with Israeli diplomat Alon Pincus and the Council on Foreign Relations, Steve Cook, this is a 20-point plan. We're dealing with points 1 and 2, and every point thereafter gets harder. And it's really, really unclear how a lot of them are going to get addressed, including Palestinian self-governance, the de-arming of Hamas, the rebuilding of Gaza. The estimates are $80 billion to rebuild Gaza. I think that's a low estimate. Gaza is gone. There is nothing there. But also the fact that the Netanyahu administration remains in power in Israel, and that in the United States you have a Trump administration that was zeroed in on the hostages. Admirable to be zeroed in on the hostages, but oblivious to the bad acts of the Israeli government, which the United States government supported. Acts that have been likened to genocide because they're like genocide. 70,000 people are dead. 20,000 of those people at least are children. None of them deserve to die. And 2 million people essentially have been displaced, and the entire place brought to ruins. And, the question is, we're not going to pay for rebuilding it. Regional powers are going to pay for rebuilding it. They're not going to pay for rebuilding it unless there is some kind of governing mechanism there that works, but also that ultimately is controlled by the Palestinians. The Israelis don't want to accept that. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is going to be a long, hard slog just to get a little past this. And frankly, the odds right now are that the talks will break down sooner or later, and ultimately we'll be right back at it. Another point that was made by Alon Pincus yesterday, and I strongly urge you to go download or go to YouTube and watch this conversation on our YouTube channel, is that there could also be actions in the West Bank which inflame this, because this Israeli government seems intent on pulling the West Bank apart and ultimately, officially or unofficially, effectively annexing it. So celebrate what's worth celebrating. Approach what is happening in the future with the right amount of caution and concern. Oh, and let me add one other thing. we're doing later today, Friday, a second podcast on this that will provide a more in-depth perspective from a Palestinian American, but point of view, but somebody who's a specialist in that, and also regional perspective on it. Two excellent commentators, Shibli Talami and Kim Gaddis, who are regular experts we turn to. So we have two in-depth podcasts on this that I encourage you, if you can, watch it on YouTube. That it's kind of a better experience, and we'll continue to cover it, obviously, but this will give you much more in-depth perspective than you'd be getting, on legacy media, for example.
President Trump's efforts to deploy federalized National Guard troops to Democratic-led cities faces significant legal opposition in two separate court hearings on Thursday. In Chicago, a federal judge issued a 14-day temporary restraining order blocking the deployment of any state's National Guard to Illinois, stating there was no credible evidence of a rebellion and that the deployment would likely cause civil unrest. Concurrently, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals held arguments on whether to lift a lower court order that similarly blocked troop deployment into Portland, Oregon. These dueling hearings set the stage for a major legal battle over the limits of the president's authority to use the military and domestic law enforcement roles against the wishes of local and state governments.
Yeah, and this is something we discussed on our Deep State Radio podcast with Corey Shockey, who's an expert in civilian military relations, David Sanger, the New York Times, and Rosa Brooks, our original three partners in doing all of this when we started these podcasts almost a decade ago. The abuses here are violations of multiple laws, and judges are saying so. The question is whether the Supreme Court is going to go along with lower court judges, because we've got this kind of strange split that's emerging in the federal judiciary where lower courts tend to rule against the Trump administration because they're breaking the law. And when it gets up to the Supreme Court, they get reversed, and they tend to find a reason to support the Trump administration. Sound corrupt? Sound broken? Yeah, there's a reason it sounds that way. But this is going to be a big issue. And as we've talked about it all week, maybe a central issue in terms of defining what are the powers of the president post the rewriting of the Constitution by the Roberts Court.
President Trump stated his administration plans to use the ongoing government shutdown to permanently cut federal programs popular with Democrats, describing them as programs, quote, that aren't popular with Republicans, frankly, end quote. This threat is the latest move in the funding stalemate, which Trump blamed on Democrats, saying they will get a little taste of their own medicine. As an early implementation of this strategy, the administration has already frozen billions in funding for infrastructure and climate projects in Democratic-leaning areas like New York City and Chicago.
Yeah, let's look at this from several perspectives. One, it's illegal. The White House doesn't have the right to withhold monies that are allocated by the Congress. Under the Constitution, the Congress has the power of the purse, the power to administer these funds. The White House asserts that under certain emergency circumstances, it can control this. Again, this goes back to the question of just how much latitude they have in defining what that is. But, these are illegally withheld funds, and it is entirely partisan. Which is incredibly un-American. First of all, in these blue states and in these blue cities, a lot of Republicans live, so they're all going to be hurt from it. But a lot of the revenue that goes into funding these funds actually comes from blue states, which tend, in many cases, to be net contributors to the federal budget, as opposed to some states, many of which are red, that are net recipients of money from the federal budget. It's bad governance, it's inhumane, it's vindictive, and it's illegal.
Hear, hear.
Well, did you see the news this morning about the Nobel Peace Prize rally?
Yeah, I noticed a particular orange president wasn't named with that one.
He wasn't named. He's been campaigning for it since he got into office. Now the nominations, process essentially closed a while back. In fact, we're just 100 and some odd days from the deadline for next year's nomination to close. Trumpists say, well, he solved all these wars. Do the fact check, read the fact checks. It's just not true. Is what he's doing in Gaza substantial? Yes. Should he win a Nobel Peace Prize for it? Well, you can draw your own conclusions. I think if you support war crimes by underwriting them, giving people weapons, and providing diplomatic cover, you probably shouldn't win a peace prize. Or if you blow up boats on the high seas, you shouldn't win a peace prize. But the recipient of this award today, a woman who is the leader of the opposition in Venezuela, sends another message. A message which probably did not go down too well in the White House. Why? Because she's a democracy advocate, and she's a Latina. And, they call democracy advocates Antifa. She's standing up against an authoritarian government. The idea that a Latina would beat him, a democracy advocate would beat him, somebody standing up against authoritarianism would beat him, must be galling. If you read the citation, the message is kind of pointed about people who are undermining democracy, and that's actually an important thing to the Nobel Prize Committee. So Trump may want to keep that in the back of his mind if he really wants to win an award like this, which he should never win under any circumstances. But it's even slightly more galling than that to Trump world, because one of the people who nominated this woman, who's an opponent of the Maduro regime, was Marco Rubio, back when he was a senator. So here you've got somebody who's actually not, crazy left winger. She's a sort of centrist. In fact, she supports some politicians in Latin America who make me a little uncomfortable, because they're kind of on the spectrum that leads you to dysfunctional right-leaning governments. But she, I think is what they call in Major League Baseball is kind of a message pitch. It's that if you're Donald Trump, you can't read this thing and see it as anything less than a complete rebuke of your policies here in the U.S. Anyway, for some reason, they said this will be announced at 5 a.m. And I woke up at 5 a.m. like, oh, I really want to see what's going to happen here. And while it wasn't the kind of person who I would have picked, there is no Rothkopf Peace Prize, sadly, because there's no Rothkopf fortune from the creation of dynamite, as there was in the Nobel Prize case. But I would have liked to see somebody like Jose Andres, who's been feeding people in war-torn regions, which would have sent even a different message. But wasn't Trump. Obviously, it's galling to him. Will be interesting to watch the commentary that comes on this a little later today. Anyway, as I said, we've got another in-depth podcast looking at the situation in the Middle East coming up. Watch it on YouTube, watch it here, watch bits and pieces of it on Instagram or elsewhere, other social media platforms. And we will be back with you next week, just not on Monday. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to some of what I'm talking about, just go to the front of your queue from this week and listen to some of that stuff on Monday. And we'll see you on Tuesday. Until then, Riley, have a good weekend. Minna, wherever you are, have a good weekend. And everybody else, have a good weekend. Bye-bye.